Hi guys, welcome back. We are here with Brian Clifton right now. And Brian is recognized internationally as a Google Analytics expert that has helped shape the industry. And he's also an author. His best-selling books have sold more than 100,000 copies and are used by students and professionals worldwide. And he is Google's first head of web analytics for Europe. And Brian also has built a pan-European team of product specialists within Google. So he has a very big legacy, and he will be joining us today in a keynote talking about Google Analytics and how to avoid bad data. So Brian, I'm just letting you take the stage right now. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Juliana.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to be talking about Google Analytics and specifically how to avoid bad data. And this has come about as an enterprise study, so large corporate enterprises, and looking at their data quality via auditing. So I'll be very brief on this slide. You can always, well, please do, in fact, connect with me via LinkedIn. But essentially, I've been around for a while. I'm a scientist by training. I did my chemistry degree and PhD at Bristol University. As Juliana was introducing me there, I was the very first actually head of web analytics for Google back in the day when Google Analytics was acquired and launched in 2005. I've written a number of books in the area, and now my focus is on a product, a cloud-based software tool called Verified Data, which is all about automating accuracy and governance. All the data that I'm talking about and presenting today actually all comes from the use of verified data. So when we're engaging with clients, one of the questions I ask really is to get a feel for, where the client is with their data. And I simply ask the question, do you trust your data? It turns out that almost invariably I get the same answer, not really, or maybe just for the basic numbers. And it comes down to a lack of trust. And I haven't seen any differences in terms of e-commerce versus non-e-commerce, whether those website operators or managers are more trusting of their data or not. And I've seen no geographic differences either. I get the same kind of answers that the data setup is often poorly understood. People don't know exactly where this data is coming from. Yes, page view data, that's fairly obvious, but beyond that, where does the data come from? The collected data is rarely verified, so no one really knows if the setup they have now, which was possibly done several years ago in the past, actually matches what the website is trying to do today. So the data has a kind of bad smell, as is often told to me. And also there is a history in this industry, in fact, of poor data governance. So people playing and experimenting with data, particularly with Google Analytics, I would say, because it's free and has been free since launch, that people experiment and play with data and haven't really thought about governance like we have to these days. So what people are expecting or what people want is that nice sort of clean distribution on the left there, the green chart. But actually, usually what happens is websites end up with this kind of scatter approach of data points of poor quality. And even if you start off with the nice green chart, it only takes maybe 6-12 months because of the fast changing pace of the web to end up in a poor state. So bad data is actually, what do we mean by this? It's actually quite straightforward to define. What I'm talking about is duplicate data, obviously firing two hits to Google Analytics when only one is required. It's also missing data, so things that are happening on the page, perhaps not being tracked, because by default, Google Analytics and pretty much all analytics tools, they need setup to do that. They will track page views by default, but not anything else. That needs some input. We're talking about inaccurate data. We're talking about incorrect data, of course, data that's just wrong. And nowadays, we also have to think about personal data. So collecting data into your back-end sales system and passing that and communicating that between your banks and payment gateways, of course, that's fine. But what you don't want to be doing is also collecting that kind of data in web analytics tools. And I'll come to this again a little bit later. So there are many reasons why we end up with bad data. These are the kind of 4 that I highlight. Websites constantly change. We know that. It's the new products are coming through, new technologies are being launched. There's usually a lot of other people involved. It's not just one team or one individual. There can be several stakeholders in an organization. It can be marketing, it can be sales, it can be IT, and of course, lots of other agencies that are helping you. Tend to be time pressures, and I don't mean to be rude but say laziness, but time pressures just means when a marketing team is pushing a campaign, usually analytics, the measurement of that campaign is the last thing to be thought of. But if I had to pick one thing out of this that makes this just difficult to find bad data, it's the fact that it looks just like good data. These are not my kids, by the way, but they're cute anyway. They look both the same. It really is hard to differentiate, and you end up with what I call needles in impossible haystacks. So that's the background. Let's have a look at the study then. So this is a scorecard methodology. It's very easy to understand. I think anyone in management would have seen this type of technique before, and we've adapted it for our purposes. What we have here on the left-hand side are all the areas summarized. So these are 15 different areas that are checked, and you can group these into two sections, governance and accuracy. You can't really have accurate data without good governance, and from good governance comes good data accuracy. So those two things go hand in hand. And those sections there on the left are a summary. There's over 200 what we call unit tests going on. So we're checking, doing a sort of decision tree logic on the data to see if data is present or missing or duplicated, the things that I said earlier. And they're all summarized here in this scorecard format. And so if you just focus on one of these, so each one of these columns represents an audit. And we're using a scoring system here. If everything's working fine, no duplicates, no missing data, etc., and it passes all of the tests, then it gets a score of 10 and it has the green tick. That's the visualization. If there's a gray area, if there are some parts which are perhaps partially tracked, so not the complete picture, if you like, or the data is a little bit iffy, there's some suspicious numbers in there, then it gets an amber color code and a score of 5. And if the data is missing or just plain wrong, then it's 0 and it's a red. Now, those scores are multiplied by the weightings, and the weighting really is a reflection of how important each one of these areas is to the business. Of course, every business is different, so you can adjust these. As you can see, most of these weightings are actually a 1. And what that means is all of those with a weighting of 1 are actually equally important to the business. There's a couple of exceptions in this example that I'm showing, where I've made the weighting 2. In other words, I'm saying that these particular sections are twice as important as everything else. The ones I've focused on here are PII compliance. So that's the personal identifiable information. You really don't want that. That's got all sorts of implications for your business there if you do that. So I've given that a higher weighting of 2. And also transaction tracking, just doubling that weighting, making it more important, because that's often the reasons why e-commerce sites exist in the first place. Excuse me. So what we do is we simply multiply the scoring system here by the weighting. We sum and normalize all of these sections, which just means basically the total is out of 100. And that gives us a quality index score. Here in this example, the quality index is 29.4. It's out of 100. So what we're saying is this particular website audit is a very low score. It's only 29 points, if you like, out of 100, where 100 would be a best quality, a best practice data quality score. So from this study, so we've done this across 75 websites. These are all enterprise brand leaders in their particular markets. 13 of them with a global presence, so the kind of mega brands that you would have heard of. Not all of these are e-commerce. 41% had an e-commerce facility, and I'm very interested in looking at the differences between e-commerce and non-e-commerce. And as I think I mentioned in the intro, I haven't really seen any differences. It appears that everybody has the same type of problems. And in terms of traffic volume, we're talking typically between 100,000 to 10 million visits per month. There were 3 over 100 million. And the two graphs there, just kind of a breakdown of the market sector. So the left-hand chart is the business vertical. The peak there is B2C retail. That's where we happen to have done most of these audits on. And the right-hand chart there is just the country or region in which those websites focus. I happen to live and work in Sweden, so there's a bias there in the number of Swedish websites we've audited. So let's come on to the results then. So this is a visualization of Google Analytics data quality. Coming back to this is where we started from the example. So here you see 4 different columns of colored results representing different websites being audited. Now just imagine that these columns now spread out more and more to the right, filling in more audits. And you get something that looks like this. So we have all of the sections there on the left. Each one of these columns represents a website that's been audited. Remember, we sum and normalize these to give the quality index score at the bottom there. And this just goes on to the right for 75 enterprise websites. A lot to kind of absorb there, but basically, if you just take a step back and look at this from a pattern recognition point of view, really the takeaway is there's a lot of red here. There's an awful lot of red, there's quite a lot of amber, and there's not many green ticks. The gray, by the way, is just that feature wasn't available on the website. So, for example, not every website has video tracking, for example. Not every website also had e-commerce. So that's the gray areas. But basically, even just visualizing this without doing any further analysis, you can see there's a problem here, and a big problem. So if we just look at this in a little bit more detail, and we plot this out as a histogram, you can see the distribution there is very skewed to the left. So the horizontal axis is from 0 to 100. You want as many websites, if you were the owner of these websites, you want to be pushed more to the right. You want the highest score possibly, the best quality data possible. The average here, remember, these are big enterprise websites spending a lot of money on digital full stop, a lot of money on marketing, and certainly a lot of money on analytics and understanding all of the above. The average score is only 35.7. So think about that. Out of a possible 100, the average is way below even 50. Now, 50 is a bit of a marker for me. It's a rule of thumb. Only 12% of sites score above 50. And the reason why I just have that in my own business as a rule of thumb is simply that we can't perform any analysis. We just simply say, look, if your quality score is less than 50, we really can't help you in terms of analysis. There are too many holes. There are too many gotchas. There are too many ways of producing analysis that is just flawed at the end of the day. And therefore, data quality has to be fixed before analysis takes place. This is a breakdown of all the different scores for all different sections. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through this. It would be way too tedious. You can get these results from the study website, the verify-data.com/study, if you want to look at this in more detail. I am going to highlight 3 areas. I'll start on the top right here. This was quite a shock. 1 in 5 websites, so 20%, have a PII issue. In other words, they're collecting personally identifiable information. That's a big no-no for all sorts of reasons, but now legally there's a framework called GDPR, which is really there to stop you doing this. But 1 in 5 websites have that issue. And it turns out that some of these audits were done before GDPR came out in May 2018, and some of these audits were done after that period. It turns out that this number has remained fairly steady. It's still around about 1 in 5 websites have these problems. There's a lot talked about this and a lot of attention given to it, but it seems like in terms of the reality of the data, some of this is still being collected and it hasn't really changed. And I'll give some examples of that in a second. Another one here is 82%, a very large number, 82% track their campaigns wrong. Now, if I was still working at Google, I would be very worried about this. When we did the launch of the product back in 2005, the rationale for making it free was that website owners, marketers, etc., would have this tool for free. They would get much more informed, much more understanding of what's working on their website, what isn't, and hopefully spend more money on digital marketing. And of course, Google is the king in that area. So Google will make its money in other ways by people spending more money on advertising with them. But clearly that's not working, because even today, almost 15 years after the product launch, most people get this wrong. Missing campaign parameters or confusing campaign parameters, which just makes understanding attribution and understanding what's working for you very, very difficult to understand. And then on the left-hand side there, tracking conversions. So this is both form completion, so that's sign-ups and subscriptions and things like that, so the lead generation sites, as well as transaction tracking, roughly around about the same, 24 and 26% respectively. A quarter of websites, therefore, tracking, only a quarter, sorry, tracking the conversions correctly. 75% obviously getting it wrong. So let's give you some examples of this. Personally identifiable information. I kind of knew this was a problem because I see this data, but putting it all together in an enterprise study like this was quite a shock. Now, the most common problem is that the PII gets into URLs and page titles. The reason for that is Google Analytics is by default, is a great vacuum of data. It sucks up every URL and every page title as long as the tracking code is on there. So most people didn't even realize this was happening. This was happening by mistake, by accident. There was no deliberate intent to do this. This is real data, by the way, for a very large global brand. There was no intent to do this, but as you can see here, email addresses were collected, as well as passwords as well. I think the only saving grace here is that the passwords were somehow hashed or encrypted. That's probably a good thing, but hashed or encrypted passwords are not impossible to unhash. So this is dangerous stuff. This happened before GDPR, so I think they kind of got away with it, literally. But this caused a major panic when they realized this. And I'll just point out here the number. The number of times this happened, so the number of page views that had some kind of PII was just over 13,000. That's quite a big number, but it still only represents 0.1% of their total page view traffic in this date period. So this is one of those examples of a small needle in a haystack. You really have to go looking for this because the rest of the organization isn't focused on 0.1%. They're looking at the big wins, the other 99 point whatever percent. So this comes by accident, as I was saying. It's mostly via filling forms, usually forms that are kind of thrown up quickly for a campaign page or a product or something like that, where people want to have some kind of engagement with their audience. So filling in these form fields and then submitting the request via a GET request. That means sending it to the server with a GET request. Means that those parameters end up being added to URLs. So don't do that. Simply use a POST request. That's an easy fix. And another way is, when you have these kind of login areas, these customer areas, quite often the title tags for those areas, once the visitor logs in, is, welcome back, Brian Clifton, or welcome, and then my email address or username. Be very, very careful if you're adding tracking code to anything that's behind a login, because that usually is where personal information is kept. And you want to make sure that you're not sucking that into Google Analytics. So that's accidental PII. There is also deliberate collection of data. So this is where people have had to make a decision to collect some information. This is a real example of a customer using what's called custom dimensions. They're kind of labels, visitor labels, I also call them as. Happen to be a German university of all places. And they're collecting here the gender, postal code, city, state, and birthday of some of their visitors. Now, if you think about that, these are not in themselves personally identifiable information. Whether you know I'm male or female or roughly where I live in the world or what my age is, that's not identifying me as an individual. But actually, if you start stitching these together within the same session and tracking other data, other page views, for example, that the visitors go into, you end up with this kind of data triangulation. You build up a jigsaw effect of more and more information. You are able to stitch together who the user is. And that's very important to be aware of. So yeah, when you're collecting any kind of data from the visitor, just ensure, is it proportionate to what you need? And can this kind of jigsaw data triangulation happen? Because if it can, then you're in trouble with things like GDPR. Now, what people have asked me, if we get this wrong, can we go back and delete the data? This is a new feature that was added in Google Analytics just before Christmas. And yes, you can delete data yourself from Google Analytics, but just be aware, it's very, very blunt. Here's an example. If you have a problem with URLs, like the one I showed you earlier, there's some PII in there, you need to delete. You put in your date range where this happened. So in this case, I put in the month of October last year, and the fields to delete URL. All URLs, and I mean all URLs within that date range, will be deleted, not just the ones that have PII. That's going to be a huge hole in your data if you go ahead with that. You may have no choice, but point I'm trying to make is think about this beforehand so that you don't end up in this situation. So let's come back to something very specific to, I think, what you guys are looking at, transaction tracking. Remember, only 1 in 4 websites got this right. And you probably remember this slide. So the areas that we're talking about, what we're looking at for bad data. And this is what I mean from an e-commerce point of view. Duplicate data means duplicate transactions, and I'll show you an example of that. Promotions and product lists, amazes me how often these are just missing. They're not there. I think when people implement enhanced e-commerce tracking, they're very much focused on the checkout and the conversion, i.e. the purchase. That makes complete sense. Obviously, the purchase is the most important thing to track. But if you think about promotions, these are your internal banners, the on-site marketing efforts that you're trying to do to nudge your visitors into a conversion. So in other words, does a click on a banner, a promotion banner on your website, increase your conversion rate? That's a very obvious and often asked question, but often it's just missing in the data stream. Inaccurate data, I'm talking about inconsistent data. Remember that enhanced e-commerce is hit scoped. That means every push requires the same information to be contained in it. Otherwise, you can end up with orphan data. Timing issues, so this is when data is pushed into the data layer, but there's no trigger that sends that information into Google Analytics. And the PII is just the usual suspects, the name, address, the personal stuff that, yes, you need in your backend system, but no, you shouldn't be spreading around on the internet in Google Analytics or anywhere else for that matter. Sorry. So duplicate transactions. This is by far the most common problem. Whenever I look at an e-commerce website, I would say this pops up around about 50% of the time. Just like a banking transaction, every purchase should be treated as unique. Just like every reason for a purchase is unique, and you'll want to know what's driving your conversions for you. And if they're not unique, then you just won't know that. So, for example, what happens to your attribution? If you have the same order ID being updated, the answer is it becomes a mess. You end up with the second transaction, the duplicate or triplicate or whatever it is, overwriting the attribution for the first one. So you want to be very careful with that. This can happen for many reasons, but often people are trying to update an existing order. Perhaps it's to do with order corrections, or it's upsells or cross-sells. Perhaps deposits have been paid and then the balance needs to be paid, and you want to do that, obviously referring back to the original transaction. Just append some other number to the end of the original transaction ID. Just use, in this example, M for modified, M1, M2, M3, or whatever fits your system. It doesn't matter. In this case, it's a simple change, but you're able to always refer to the original ID, and you're able to see how many modifications were made and look at exactly what those modifications are, but keep it unique. Other strange things that we've seen and things that we check for in the data, just oddities. I mean, here was one that drove the marketing team nuts for a while. It's why do we see negative tax in our e-commerce reports? Does that mean the government is giving us money back? And I've highlighted, as you can see, rows 500 to 509. So this wasn't in all of their data, just a section of it. But it drove them nuts. They didn't know why. Why do we have negative values here? The setup was conducted several years ago, and the original team that did this had moved on. So no one could actually, from the IT team, describe what this is. So we had to spend a bit of time figuring out why this was. As I said, it wasn't every transaction. It turns out this particular website has business customers as well as private customers. And of course, business customers, if they fill in their VAT ID number, they buy without having to pay VAT, without having to pay the sales tax. So they were simply trying to be clever here and removing the tax from the yeah. Actually, I'm not sure what they were doing, because adding negative numbers just didn't make sense. Just simply think about this properly. Think about how your data is going to be collected and shown and how people are going to interpret it, and just change the pricing. That was the answer here. Instead of having the full retail price, if you're a business customer, very easy to do this on the website. Just change the pricing for those business customers to reflect they're not paying tax, rather than manipulating the tax field in this way. And then lastly, we see timing issues. So this is often causes a lot of problems. Google Analytics will capture transactions in real time. So if somebody makes a purchase at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, that's when the purchase will be logged as and shown as in your reports. It may be that your back-end sales system is actually doing the processing in batches. Perhaps it will do it the next day on a Saturday morning, or perhaps it will wait till Monday morning when the banks are open. There's a discrepancy there, which means when you're looking at your data window in Google Analytics, it might not match the data window you're trying to compare it with in your backend system. And I generally advise customers not to process refunds through Google Analytics. You can do it. It's a little bit clunky, but it is possible. Of course, you know, your business needs to know about refunds, and that should be done through your sales and customer databases. And you need to know that, and you need to know why. But Google Analytics and web analytics tools in general, they're really there to measure the performance of your website, how well your on-site marketing is doing, how well your website architecture is doing at nudging your visitors to become customers, and of course, how good is your advertising and your marketing and your SEO efforts are doing to bring visitors to the website and to convert them into customers. If I buy a pair of shoes on your website and I later return it because, I don't know, they're the wrong size or the wrong color, or I just changed my mind, that really is not a reflection of your marketing efforts or your website. Those are other reasons, and therefore removing or refunding that within your Google Analytics and taking away the credit from your marketing efforts, just to me, just seems not the right thing to do. So I generally avoid that. Of course, if you have something specific you want to analyze, and maybe refunds is a big part of your business model, particularly clothing, things like that, they expect a lot of refunds. Just think it through carefully to make sure you understand what you're going to be comparing. So why are we in this position? Well, I think I said at the beginning there was that, you know, we are, you know, essentially what we do when we're checking for data qualities, we are looking for needles in, you know, difficult haystacks. That means it's hard to find and therefore easy to hide and easy just to ignore. But all of this can be avoided. And I give you five tips really to get on top of this. Firstly, stop auditing manually. People have tried this in the past. I've done many audits manually in the past. It just doesn't work because it's just so time consuming and laborious. Takes an awful lot of effort, and it's not something that you can delegate to an office junior. It requires a lot of expertise and it requires a lot of experience. So don't do that, because you'll probably do it once and never again. If possible, try and get the auditing, the verification of your data done independently. So obviously not by the people who have a vested interest to make themselves look good. You need to be quite critical, quite warts and all, not to point the finger of blame at anyone, but actually to get the thing fixed. So try to do that independently. Automate as much as you can. Automate the heavy lifting, so that hunting down and finding the information is really the difficult part, you know, finding those needles, and spend your time on doing the fixes. So fix the priorities, fix the low-hanging fruit, and do this regularly as well, which is why automation is so important. Data quality is not a sort of set and forget process. You really need to keep on top of it, because it doesn't take long before, even if you had a perfect best practice setup, and even if you were able to verify you had no personal data coming in, very soon a simple little change can make that all go pear-shaped.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I am finished. I will just say, have a 1% rule. This is my little rule. Just spend 1% of your budget on making sure that the data is in good condition. And of course, as I've shown, and the reason why I present around the world is to get people to audit their data. You don't have to use our tool, but if you do, please try the free trial and connect to me on LinkedIn and just give me your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys, and see you guys in the next session. Bye.
As an e-commerce manager, you want to stop spending money on expensive ads. OmniConvert Explore helps you improve conversion through A/B testing, personalization, and surveys. Understand that growth is also a matter of retention, not only acquisition. With OmniConvert Reveal, you'll understand segments, monitor customer experience, and nurture your customers on every channel.